Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or wherever you're joining us from. I'm delighted to welcome you to the first UNU-INWEH Science Talk of 2025. My name is Dr. Miriam Axel, and I'm delighted to be your host today. Before we begin, I'd like to extend a huge thank you and congratulations to Professor Grace Oluwasanya, who hosted the inaugural Science Talks in 2024, setting a very high bar for us all. A big thank you also goes to Dr. Mir Mateen, whose technical wizardry has been instrumental in making these sessions run seamlessly, and to our leadership director, Professor Kaveh Madani, and Deputy Director, Dr. Manzoor Kadir. For those of you new to UNU-INWEH Science Talks, this weekly series showcases the exciting research of UNU-INWEH and its affiliates, spotlighting real-world applications that address pressing global challenges. But these talks are not just academic exercises. They're an invitation to engage with science that drives positive change. I'm pleased to share that all previous science talks are available on demand on our website and on our YouTube channel. Our website is unu.edu/INWEH/science-talks. Today's talk, like all others, will be recorded, and both the video and slides will be made available after the session. We'll conclude with an interactive question and answer session where I'll be moderating your questions to make sure that we get the most pressing thoughts and ideas. Please type your questions into the Q&A box and I will share them with our speaker. Now, it's my great honor to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Mark Workman. Dr. Workman is the lead for strategic foresight for the net zero transition at UNU-INWEH, and he is the director of Foresight Transitions Ltd and an affiliate researcher at Imperial College London, where he contributes to the NERC-funded Carbon Dioxide Removal Hub, CO2RE, Directorate Hub. His expertise lies in systemic risk, deep uncertainty, and exploratory approaches to net zero, and more broadly, decision-making. He has strongly advocated for an open, participatory, and inclusive approach to exploring the net zero transformation. He has an impressive and multifaceted career, which spans roles as a coastal engineer, environmental economist, and strategist. He's undertaken military tours, led extreme and high-risk expeditions worldwide, and has run multi-million-dollar business units. He has 2 military awards for leadership. Dr. Workman's talk, titled Using Robust Decision-Making to Explore Critical Factors in Financing Greenhouse Gas Removal Technologies to Reach Net Zero, will delve into the pressing need to scale carbon dioxide removal technologies and the critical role of public-private partnerships in driving this transition. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Mark Workman to the Science Talk stage. Mark, over to you.
Right, thanks very much for that kind introduction, and to the rest of the UNU team for allowing me to give this presentation. Can I just confirm that you can actually see my slide deck?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. That's excellent. So thank you very much for that intro and this opportunity. In terms of my specialization, just sort of a slightly sort of sharper version of that, I'm essentially a specialist in strategic foresight. So I use mixed methods to identify risks and opportunities in different possible futures. Now, this presentation is probably as much philosophical as it is technical. And as alluded to in Miriam's very kind introduction, I tend to specialize in the anthropological aspects of decision-making and creativity. I really do believe that there's an important role for models, but I always think that models have resulted in massive overreach in terms of their ability to support decision-making. And I actually think that they should play a much smaller role within the decision-making process, and indeed that their convening power is actually possibly more important and possibly their most powerful component to the decision-making process. So in sum, what I'm saying very badly is that I think models are important, but I think people don't know how to use them as effectively as they should do. I mean, with regards to creativity, I'm always blown away how wonderful our younger generation is at thinking about creativity, and perhaps how the academic system isn't nurturing some of those skills as much as they want. I mean, I love the idea that there are only 12 notes in music and there are only 26 letters in the alphabet, but on your phone or through Apple Music, you can have 100 million songs available. I mean, that just demonstrates how creativity can be realized. I think focusing in on what the presentation is about, it's very much about dealing with net zero and giving the net zero transition the respect as to the high dimensionality and what is actually known and knowable about that future transition. And I think there's inherently been a lack of humility, perhaps, in the way that we think about that future. I'm not sure anyone really knows what the net zero transition or indeed the future, and I think this becomes all the more salient next week, what the future will hold for both the world or individual countries throughout the world. And I think there are two sort of underpinning challenges that I would place, particularly with regards net zero. How much can you rely on past data sets as a way of characterizing the future? I mean, anticipating the future by driving forwards using only the rear view mirror to guide you is inherently going to be an unsuccessful strategy. And yet a lot of far future modeling processes use past data sets on the very basis that by looking through the rear view mirror, you can assess what the future will hold. And we have to think very carefully about what we're trying to achieve when addressing net zero and managing the future risks and uncertainty within that option space, and in the sort of face of climate change. You know, are we looking to make sure that we develop an optimal net zero future, i.e. one that is perfect, or are we actually making sure that the worst implications and manifestations of the realizing of net zero are avoided? And you deploy your resources very differently in the same way that you deploy your resources very differently when you're trying to win a war from one when you're actually trying not to lose one. And I really do think that in net zero, with the scale of the transition and the risk to communities and future generations all over the world, that we should possibly be thinking about how not to lose it. So what I'm now going to do is put together this, essentially cover off the following 5 aspects. Essentially, I'll cover off the justification for the use of a different set of decision support tools to that we've used in the past. In order to justify the need for a new set of decision support tools, particularly around deep uncertainty and interdisciplinary systems thinking, get a better understanding as to the role of uncertainty to therefore justify the use of these new tools. And then I'm going to give a very short introduction a very short case study regarding the application of decision making under deep uncertainty to private sector strategic investment decision making around business models for what effectively needs to be one of the world's largest sectors in the next 25 years, the greenhouse gas removal sector. For those that don't know, the greenhouse gas removal sector is tasked with net negative emissions, i.e. they remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And we need a sector larger than the agricultural and the oil and gas sector combined. And we need that within the next 30 years if the modeling community around net zero is to be believed. And then what I'd like to touch on at the end is that the power of the UNU and academia more broadly lies in the opportunities for collaboration and learning from each other. And I'm just very keen to put out there some areas that Miriam and I are thinking of working together on, which would be great to have other members of the community on that journey. So let's get started. In terms of stories from the front line, I'm going to cover this fairly quickly. But in essence, there is actually an inherent crisis of confidence, I think I'd state, with regards to the use of the orthodox tools around net zero. Ultimately, socio-technical aspects are generally underestimated, particularly if you take the climate modeling and how that integrates into financial modeling. And the finance community is particularly weak at addressing these things, mainly because the climate modeling and the implications of climate change and the realization of net zero are very poor at addressing cascade effects and tipping points. And so therefore, you tend to have some very conservative ways that the finance sector assesses the risks to net zero and climate change. Inherently, a lot of these tools, this is playing to item 3 here, they tend to close down the decision space and the opportunity for dialogue between different communities as a function of their optimization approach. And then more importantly, there is an inherent capture by the elites through the IPCC process. You can see where the IPCC process has an important function, but perhaps there is a need for a more participatory, pluralistic basis that sits within that. And so this is sort of an inherent challenge that I would place to the work that we do on net zero and the set of orthodox tools that we have. And this slide very much plays to net zero, particularly around some of the research that we've done within the core directorate hub, where we essentially did some ethnographic assessment of what was considered to be the tensions within the realization of a greenhouse gas removal sector or a carbon dioxide removal sector within the UK. And we essentially found that the most important tensions to the realization of this sector would very much have societal implications that cannot be resolved through pure technocratic processes, and they can't be parameterizable, which means you can't model it, and therefore, you can't actually resolve these issues through the way that governments are traditionally run. There is a massively important role for decentralized participatory engagement. And yet, unfortunately, particularly in the UK, and I can't speak for other countries in the world, a lot of the ability to do that has been lost through for all sorts of reasons. And ultimately, that results in a massive vulnerability for our ability to achieve. In the UK, we need about 60 to 100 million tons of greenhouse gas removal to be achieved by 2050. So, playing on some of these issues, there are inherent cracks around the orthodoxy with regards to present tools that we use. And in the UK, we're wedded to something called consolidative modelling approaches, which very much build an avatar of the world and pretend that you can actually sketch out the way that you think it works. In essence, what's happening now is that climate change is believed to be happening at a rate that climate scientists can't model. Ultimately, we surpassed 1.5 degrees change from pre-industrial levels last year. The assumptions regarding the diffusion of decarbonisation are increasingly problematic. And as per just advocated earlier, the dominant models consistently fail to adequately reflect the financial aspects and the implications of climate change. And let's face it, if you get the finance industry interested and bought into this, a lot of the issues tend to sort of be easier to deal with. So they're acting in terms of the reallocation of resources within various economies. So what we state here is that orthodox methods effectively conceal the existence of uncertainty at a time when uncertainty is rapidly proliferating. And we therefore, the subject of today's talk, and what I'm going to give an example of, is that we need a broader toolkit that empowers decision makers to actually engage with this uncertainty rather than hiding it going forward. And in essence, the evidence of the fact that we are struggling, or the tools that we have at our disposal are struggling, is shown by the sort of collection of Financial Times presentations here, in that ultimately the global financial crisis was said to be unforeseeable. For example, that's this slide here, where the Bank of England shows a fan diagram and where the growth in the UK economy would take place. And then rather than actually growing, it actually fell off a cliff, as demonstrated here. The global financial crisis of 2008 resulted in some of the biggest bankruptcies in history and left over 30 million people unemployed globally. And it cost the global economy about $20 trillion and brought a lot of countries to the brink of insolvency, Greece and Spain and so on. And yet, in November 2007, a survey of professional forecasters examining 45,000 economic data series foresaw less than a 1 in 500 chance of an economic meltdown. And this is carried over to the fact that there's more and more concern regarding the ability for the financial models to track these things. And there's even less confidence in the existing forecasting tools to do what they're supposed to do anyway. For example, Ben Bernanke was called in to do a review in the Bank of England because the Bank of England, like a lot of central banks, failed to give sufficient forward guidance as to the amount of inflation that would take place over the period 2021 to 2023. The Bank of England forecast 6%, when in fact it came out 11.9%. And that was replicated in Central European Bank, and the Federal Reserve as well. So what do all these things have in common? The data is sparse, the data is inexact, and the fact is the structure of economies and the structure of the systems more broadly shift over time. And not only that, is that in spite of the fact that climate change has seemed to be an ever prescient matter, surveys consistently taken out by third-party organizations and corporates, actually organizations themselves think that they are not sufficiently prepared or even talking about it. In this particular survey by the Dragonfly Strategic Outlook, 2024 states that 43% of organizations don't believe that they are able to cope with the effects of climate change. So why is this? And I think I would advocate that one of the reasons is a function of the tools that we use to analyze and think about climate change. So how do we justify the need for a new suite of tools? Essentially, this is going to cut along the fact that uncertainty, though it's a multi-dimensional issue, I'm going to just cut along this component called levels of uncertainty, just to give the attendees an idea as to what I'm getting at. So in essence, when it comes to levels of uncertainty, you can arbitrarily split the uncertainty space into 4 different levels. At the bottom level, you have a construct where the future is going to be very similar, or if not exactly the same as the past, and therefore you're able to do simple regression analysis, and therefore work out what's happened in the past will be replicated in the future. And the system tends to be bounded. So this is exactly like rolling a dice on a flat table at standard room temperature and pressure. You know that there's only going to be 6 outcomes, and no matter how you roll the dice, it will land on one of those 6 faces and give you a result. Then there's the construct around shallow uncertainty, where perhaps you need to develop more probabilistic type outcomes. And in that, what I compared that to is rolling 2 dice on a rocking boat in a round glass bottoms vessel, whereby there actually might result in cock dice, where it's slightly ambiguous as to which face it would fall on, and therefore you get more. It's still the system is still bounded, but the fact is there's a proliferation in the possible number of outcomes, and therefore, but you will be able to associate rough probabilities within that. And then what you've got at the next level is this construct called deep uncertainty. Now that's like rolling dice on the International Space Station in 0 gravity. You have no idea how to interpret when the die have landed, and even how to read them. And I'll argue that a lot of climate change impacts and net zero transformation requirements fall very much into this category. We just don't know, and the level of ambiguity is very tricky to understand. And then ultimately, there is the need to actually recognize that we are ignorant. It is impossible to know. It is not possible to know many of the implications of climate change and the net zero transition. We are very bright, but the brighter we become, the greater the uncertainty, is the paradox. So what is this construct around deep uncertainty that I'm looking to unpack in this half-hour talk? Ultimately, there are 3 tests for whether or not a problem is steeped in deep uncertainty. First one is whether or not you are able to understand what the drivers are for a system and the resultant outcome. And ultimately, if you don't have a common set of conceptual models amongst people, then you are probably in deep uncertainty. Another test is that you can't develop a probabilistic distribution function as a function of the drivers and the outcome that you're seeking to evaluate. And then the final point is that the agreed metrics as to evaluate desirability, if you ask 10 different people what the desired outcome of the stimulus on the impact and outcome, you would get 10 different answers. And yet traditional tools just are prone to least cost, and yet the benefits and the outcomes might be resilience. It might be that co-benefits are maximized, or regret is least. And yet if you ask 10 different people, they have 10 different outcomes. So if you can't agree on what the metrics are, it makes decision making, particularly around optimization tools, highly problematic to apply. And so the argument that we make is that the different levels of uncertainty require different forms of decision support tools. And I'll literally just touch upon those. So when you're dealing with rolling the dice effectively on a flat table at standard room temperature and pressure, or on a rocking boat in a round bottom glass vessel, what you can use are something called consolidative approaches, where you gather all the knowledge into a model that sketches out the way that you think the world is going to work going forward. In these bounded systems, you can essentially use that model as a surrogate for the real world within the limits of the model that you should be aware of. And in that space, you can make prediction and you can develop some kind of probabilistic function, whether it be Bayesian or otherwise. And then what you then have when it comes to deep uncertainty and indeterminism, i.e. a lot of ignorance around what the future option space is that you want to use exploratory approaches where you map assumptions onto consequences, but essentially you're accommodating for chaotic systems thinking, and you're essentially exploring the decision space and working out how the decision space is going to impact the decisions that you want to make. So it flips the construct. You're not looking to see how the world works and asking what if questions. You're seeing how survivable are the decisions or strategies that you're looking to test in those possible futures. So taking that into further detail, what does consolidative modeling do? It tends to seek to optimize, and you're seeking an optimal outcome under a fixed set of assumptions, whereby the actors have perfect knowledge of the future and you are minimizing costs because they're prone to least cost optimization. And that's very much the way that whole systems optimization tools for energy system transformation has been modeled, both at national level, particularly in the UK, but not exclusively so, UK, US, and no doubt other countries in the world, and very much so at the IPCC and the integrated assessment modeling community, which dominates the way that we think about the net zero transformation. Your goal is to figure out the best guess of the future and then design a future for that. And you're looking to optimize and maximize expected utility by making sure that you go for least cost, and therefore you're providing a public good to make sure that welfare is distributed elsewhere within the economy. And you're asking the question, what is likely to happen? And most importantly, psychologically, you are asking a predict and act. You're looking to predict what the future might be and respond to that. And then you're thinking about what the best near-term decision, and you can run some very simple sensitivity analysis as to what the implications of different drivers might be on that expected utility maximization future. So what you develop is very sort of fragile type futures going forward. And what you're looking to do with exploratory approaches is you flip the construct on its head. You're looking to explore and manage rather than characterize the nature of uncertainty. And more importantly, you're being explicit that the uncertainty is there. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to identify the greatest vulnerabilities across as broad range of futures as you possibly can to identify when your strategy performs the best across those known unknowns. And then what you want to do is you want to minimize regrets, and you want to assess the assumptions that have gone into your decision. So, for example, in the UK and particularly Europe, and also Europe, the invasion of the Ukraine resulted in wholesale gas prices increasing sixfold. Now, in terms of consolidative modeling, you would have had to create a model whereby you would have anticipated some kind of mechanism that resulted in a sixfold increase in gas prices. With exploratory approaches, you wouldn't have to guess about the way the world works. You would just say, what would happen if there was a sixfold increase in gas prices? And ultimately, like all complexity thinking and system and thinking that is posited around chaotic thinking, chaotic systems thinking, you're working out how the systems works. And with chaotic systems, you need to experiment and prod it in order to work out how the properties actually function. So what I've got here is a pretty average schematic, whereby what we have is a portfolio of decisions or a strategy. And then what we're looking here is these dots are possible futures. So this is a futures cone. And what you're doing is you're taking that portfolio of decisions, whether it be a technology portfolio or a policy portfolio, and then flying them through that particular future, and then seeing how it performs across multiple criteria. And these criteria are co-created with stakeholders that are integral to the decision-making process. And each line represents the performance of that particular decision portfolio across this suite of possible futures. And ultimately, what you're looking to do as a part of the process is agree on decisions, propose a strategy that actually is robust across as broad a range of futures as possible, and then modify your strategy to accommodate for the inherent uncertainty space. And the key thing here is that you are able to unpack the uncertainty space. You bring decision makers and stakeholders into the process through developing these parallel axes plots. Now, levels of uncertainty is only one dimension of the multi-dimensional issue of uncertainty. Inherently, there are multiple, and here, for example, I would say that levels of uncertainty sits in one axis. There's the variety of strategic options that are available, and then there's the complexity of the system. And ultimately, net zero, I would argue, sits in the top right-hand corner of the majority of dimensions around net zero. Sorry, of uncertainty. And that if you rely on orthodox processes, you're going to only get a very, very thin perspective of this, and the exploratory approaches unpack it far better. And that's a function of the fact that consultative approaches think about things in complicated mechanisms, i.e. nested, very mechanical type thinking that allows reductionist thinking and allows predictions to risk, whereas complicated systems, you have a large number of interacting components. The aggregated activity is highly nonlinear, and the extent of that linearity and nonlinearity will fluctuate depending on all sorts of dynamics and variables that are unknowable. And they tend to exhibit hierarchical self-organization, i.e. the system flips from one system state to the other. And when a system switches from one system state to the other, a sensitivity analysis is completely meaningless. And yeah, that's about as sophisticated as we get with a lot of orthodox approaches. And also worth highlighting is the fact that though modeling approach, which is what we're unpacking here with regards to exploratory models, are a fundamental component about thinking about the future. The issue is that if you have a new modeling approach, you also need to think about the conceptual frameworks, i.e. the cultures that the users of these new models need to address, like asking the relevant questions and making sure that they are asking questions that are scientifically provable or disprovable, and therefore complying with Karl Popper's falsification principle. And you also need to think about the governance mechanisms. How do you engage with politicians, ministers, and decision makers when you're flipping this construct on its head? And this is really important. So though we're advocating the application of exploratory approaches, that in itself is going to be insufficient to address that. I just wanted to touch on that. And so dealing with the sort of getting beyond the modeling approach and dealing with conceptual frameworks, this is really, really important. And so we need to get people from these traditional approaches, which ask the question, what will future conditions be? And therefore you're developing these predictions. And I won't talk to this slide. I'll send it when I send it out, you can read it. To exploratory approaches whereby you're actually asking what the conditions will affect our current or leading strategies perform. What are the where do the conditions that our strategies fail to meet different stakeholders' goals? Which ones of those conditions are plausible such that we need to improve our strategy? And then most importantly, what decisions do we have to make now? And because you're dealing with complex systems, which ones can we defer until we've got further information? So what I'm now going to do in the last 10 minutes is hopefully cover off an example of a piece of work that we did. The significance of the work is that optimization approaches, which tend to be where the consultative modeling community work, not exclusively, there's a lot of very good consultative modeling out there, but in the whole, the ones that inform policy tend to be whole system optimizations built around whole system energy modeling. What's also very interesting about some of the innovation that's taking place in the exploratory modeling and deep uncertainty space is not only is it recognizing the extent of uncertainty, but it's actually increasing the potential for the level of fidelity. You can get beyond very flat earth conceptual perspectives down into what are important to operationalize the elements of net zeros. You can think about business use cases around business model application in the face of different types of risks and the specificity of those risks within different geographical jurisdictions and the inherent nature that the inherent high fidelity level of thinking that you need around business model development. And more importantly, by unpacking the uncertainty space, you can actually get very targeted policy interventions to get the public sector to support the private sector through some of the higher risk aspects, which is essentially what this case study is about. So the case study I'm going to talk about is policies on the UK because the core project, the Directorate Hub core project, is very much posited on UK analysis. As alluded to earlier, but I'm going to highlight it again. In the UK, sorry, globally, we are going to need about 8 gigatons of negative emissions if we manage to absolutely batten down the hatches on all the other forms of deep decarbonisation that are needed. In the UK, we need upward of 60 to 100 million tons of negative emissions. And in essence, what we've got here is a wedge diagram that highlights the different forms of technologies. And what you have here is bioenergy carbon capture and storage, whereby you harvest biomass, you combust it. Because the biomass has sequestered CO2 from the atmosphere, when it gets combusted and then captured by carbon capture and storage technology and stored geologically, the whole life cycle, subject to the way that the biomass has been cultivated and transported to the plant, results in a net negative outcome. And a lot of these technologies are based on that principle. They result in a net negative outcome. The other one that's well known is something called direct air capture, whereby you use an amine to capture CO2 straight from the atmosphere, and then you store those geologically as well. And in essence, the sector in the UK is very nascent. We have probably about 1,000 to 2,000 tons of technological removals. That's the likes of BECCS and direct air capture. And we need 60 to 100 million tons. And the government has invested upward of about 100 million directly and about 1.5 billion indirectly. And it's actually just announced 20 million over the next 20 billion, a billion each year over the next 20 years to develop indirect components of the greenhouse gas removal sector. And we're looking to grow that sector from the 2,000 tons that we're actually removing at the moment to around 60 to 100 million tons in 2050. And so the question is, what policy interventions will be needed? At the moment, a lot of the interventions have been supply side generated. And what the government is looking to do is introduce something called a feed-in tariff, whereby they will provide not a feed-in tariff, a contract for difference, which essentially allows a strike price to be set, which protects the producer from any price volatility. And by having a contract for difference, it allows the producer of the negative emissions to guarantee that they will have all their costs covered, and therefore bring down the weighted average cost of capital in order to build that plant going forward. The second tool that the government is looking to bring in is the integration of negative emissions credits into the UK emissions trading scheme. So in essence, the project was looking to understand whether or not these two policy interventions over and above the supply side interventions would be sufficient to get private sector investment into the greenhouse gas removal sector. The UK government is running a national deficit that's about 100% of GDP. So there's no way that the UK government can realistically develop the sector from the very small sector that it is now through to this 100 million tons going forward. So essentially, that's what this project was looking to assess. I don't really have time to go into this, but again, if you do look through these slides, should they be centered, this slide basically highlights the characteristics of the sector to emphasize the fact that it's deeply uncertain, and it's fraught with all sorts of information asymmetries that we can categorically state as it passing the 3 tests that I articulated earlier. In terms of the what we're looking to do, as articulated earlier, to assess the implications of these policy ecologies and their effectiveness on attracting private capital. And then what we were looking to do, and then in terms of what we found, so this is the kicker, those 2 policies, the introduction of a contract for difference and the integration in the UK ETS, we have found that they are going to provide insufficient impact for private sector investors. And what's really cool about exploratory approaches is that you can think about other tools and other models that can be brought to bear in order to get your strategy to be more robust. And what the study found was that, much like COVID, and for those that don't know, though I suspect the majority do, COVID, the emergence of, or the discovery and then the production of a vaccine in 10 months has got to represent one of the most amazing feats of human innovation as has ever been done since possibly the moon landings. And I think arguably it might even surpass that. And that about 10 years worth of innovation took place in less than 10 months through to production. And that was essentially a function of the public and private sectors working in lockstep. I think one of the hypotheses that we had in this research was that there's a need for that kind of thinking going forward. So what did we do? We conducted 17 interviews with a number of investors in the space, in the sort of general finance sector and in the greenhouse gas removal, in order to shape the decision framing, conduct something called an XRM type study. And then we built a financial model as a private equity firm would, in order to assess the investability of a company. And then we ran that financial model through different scenarios and these different policy ecologies, i.e. with no policy interventions, with just integration in the the UK ETS, just with integration into the implementation of a CFD, and then joint together as well. And then we also explored a number of other dimensions. We also explored 3 different public-private partnership models, and then we also assessed the implications of a storage credit. And the idea is that we ran, he says, having to look at his notes, we ran 243 different variances within the different financial models across those 8 different scenarios that I've just discovered. So we got about 1,944 different runs to assess the ability for the business models to be attractive to private sector investors. And the uncertainty of these models were very much in line with what the private equity sector looks for to invest: capex, rate at which the business can scale, and then the ability to generate revenue going forward. And essentially, these are the outputs. It's something called the scenarios discovery. And so these are the 2,000 modeling runs placed into different compartments as to their attractiveness of different to different investors. And what you've got here is you've got essentially the outputs put against an internal rate of return metric, where strategic investors have a lower IRR required, internal rate of return of about less than 12%. Infrastructure funds are between 15 and 12%, and private equity is around 20%. And what you find is that across 5 different business models, it was only 33 scenarios with no policy support that strategic investors might be willing to invest in BECCS. And then with enhanced weathering, only in 11% of scenarios. So not a very high chance. Now, these aren't probabilities. These are just assemblages of the modeling runs whereby they hit this threshold effect. And then what you found is even when you introduce the CFD and the inclusion of the CDR in the UK ETS, the number of scenarios whereby investors of different types were willing to invest was very, very low. So that's essentially what that says. And then more importantly, and this is demonstrating the power of the process, we managed to actually unpack the uncertainty. And so what I'm going to show you now is a parallel plot for the Bex Power business model and how the different iterations of the modeling runs in those and in the scenarios results in further fidelity and allowing real precision regarding interventions around net zero policy. So what you've got here is effectively a parallel plot, which completely unpacks the decision space and shows how the variance of those different uncertainties are manifest across these different metrics. And what you've got here is you've got something called the carbon abatement cost, which takes the entire negative emissions that are generated over the lifetime of an asset, divided by the capex and the opex to do that. And what you find is there's a trade-off between the payback period and the abatement cost, whereby you are more willing to, and the environmental benefits as well, which basically means you need a policy intervention to make sure that investors don't go for don't optimize their returns over the policy optimization of maximizing greenhouse gas removal generated. And then what's even more interesting, and when we put this in front of private equity and strategic investors, is that we found that the different policy interventions resulted in different that different private-public partnership models allowed different business models to perform differently. Again, unpacking the solution space going forward. For example, Bex Power, you would want to develop a build, operate, and transfer model, or a private finance initiative. And all of these have subtle differences as to the way that risk is managed, and that's carried by the public sector, and that's carried by the private sector. And that's essentially, again, another dimension whereby exploratory approaches allow this unpacking of the decision space and these targeted interventions if we're really serious about the realization of net zero. And so, is this calibratable? Is this provable? Is this analysis, are we able to benchmark it against another sector? Well, essentially, the students that looked at this looked at the UK offshore wind sector, where essentially in the UK we had virtually no offshore winds in the late 90s. And then what we've got now is we've got about 14 gigawatts of operational offshore wind capacity. We've got 4 gigawatts under construction, and we've got 9 gigawatts that's actually on contracts and that will be built. So we've got about, he says quickly, about 27 gigawatts, which is probably commensurate with the scale that the greenhouse gas removal sector needs to be in the next 25 years. And ultimately, that's the length of time it's taken for the offshore wind sector to be realized in 25 years. And it's resulted in a lot of investment and over 30,000 jobs in the UK. And essentially, what we found when we did this benchmarking exercise is that the offshore wind sector went through a number of different policy sequencing and iterations. I haven't got time to go into the detail here, well before it actually realized the contracts for difference. So there was over 13 years of confidence building between the public and private sector around the investment in greenhouse gas in the offshore wind sector. And yet we are going straight from grant supported policies to contracts for difference and integration. So it's more than likely that our analysis can be calibratable relative to this. And we're actually looking to do more analysis to see what the implications of these different policy interventions would be on the realization of greenhouse gas removal, carbon dioxide removal business models going forward. And more to the point, offshore wind sector is less complex than the CDR sector. Right, that is 40 minutes, which is I think 5 minutes beyond the time that I've actually got to talk. I will just say that if any of what I've said made any sense, and I hope some of it did, it doesn't always land, but when it does, it tends to be quite powerful. I would be really keen, particularly with the impressive diaspora that the UNU has, to highlight different areas for collaboration. And ultimately, one thing that we're looking to do is find a channel for the carbon dioxide removal net zero type findings from core. And so whether or not there could be capacity building papers badged under the UNU, that would be a really great opportunity. We're looking to develop greater capacity amongst policymakers and strategic decision makers around understanding better the appropriate decision support tools and applying them to the right levels of uncertainty and therefore complexity. We're looking to also potentially, should there be an appetite, to develop training tools. I'm really confident that a lot of decision making under deep uncertainty and chaotic systems thinking almost certainly needs a competency-based training. It's not something that you can pick up. It's like maths and English. You need to actually learn it. And then there's the possibility of crowdsourcing a book. But these are all very aspirational and subject to the appetite of other members within the UNU going forward. Whew. Right, so that was 42 minutes. So sorry about that, Miriam. Shall I stop sharing?
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Mark. Really, really interesting discussion. And I'm thrilled that we have some time for Q&A. I think maybe to start off, I was really pleased that you talked about opportunities for collaboration. So maybe to kick off a question about opportunities for collaboration. What role do you think academia, funders, industry participants, and other stakeholders can each play in ensuring that the GGR systems are designed with long-term sustainability, are ethical, and based on sound science? What are the different aspects that each of these partners should play?
I mean, that's not a short answer to that question. I mean, ultimately, I would argue that it's highly context specific. So giving a generic answer is quite tricky. The most important thing, and I'm advocating this more and more, is that we need to develop more bottom-up collective intelligence type processes. And with the advent of smartphones and the capacity for communities to link together through various mechanisms. I mean, ultimately, we already have a number of existing platforms, whether it be Facebook, WhatsApp groups, or whatever. I would argue that we could possibly get away from some of those and make them more locally specific. I would argue that there's a need for just greater capacity for people to actually understand what these technologies are, what the implications of net zero are, and for them to actually start highlighting some of the issues that they would like to see, and then putting those into the institutional processes that people have within their countries. The power of local community is so underestimated within the net zero transition. And I can give an example in the UK, a tiny community in a little place called St Ives, which has a population of just over 10,000 people, if you include the rural hinterland. They basically stopped a multi-million-pound project because there not enough information was known about it, and the corporate group that actually sought to implement the project didn't engage with them to explain what the issues were. And for me, that's a negative outcome, but highlights the power of community groups and the need for community groups to be engaged with, and for them to start understanding better what these issues are and just becoming more literate around what net zero really means. At the moment, there's this huge capacity gap where we read about it, in November, December time, and then it disappears for another 10 months, and then it hits the headlines again. That can't happen. This is as important as the everyday economy on every part of our life, and more importantly, the lives of our children's children. So we need to start talking about it more, and that's what needs to happen at local community level.
And I want to remind our attendees, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box. Just to pick up on your point about information, are there any, what kind of measures do you think could be implemented to help reduce these information asymmetries? Are there any kind of policy mechanisms that could help increase the systemic visibility of the GGR sector?
Well, you and I have written a paper on anticipatory governance. I would argue that the mechanisms we have at the moment for bringing more participatory processes are glaringly absent. And I can only speak for the UK. Yeah, I will probably only speak for the UK to be on safe ground, bearing in mind the broad range of folks that we'll have on this call. But the UK's capacity at local authority level to do anything beyond standard services has been completely gutted through budget cuts. And I would argue that there's a need for greater capacity building around that area, because local authorities are going to have to pick up the tab for a lot of the fallout from climate change and the impacts of climate change. And so there's a need to address that massive capacity gap around local authority and regional authority level in order to allow national agendas to therefore cascade down and be relevant and tailored to the individual locations where net zero has to take place. And so ultimately there's an institutional requirement, which is problematic, but essential. And I think people understanding that would be a very important first step. And then I do think it goes beyond the House Convention and just information. And it's about talking to community groups and thinking about these mechanisms of asking what do these things mean? And the fact is, it's already happening. It's just that no one's talking to them. So when you go to these local areas and you talk to these people, say, yeah, we've had a visioning exercise on this, but we can't find anywhere to plug it into, which links into the institutional systems. They're just islanded at the moment. And so the ability to develop some kind of dialogue and future-facing conversation is ripe for happening. I can speak for in the UK, and I suspect it's replicated elsewhere in the world. But at the moment, they can't, because there's no channel and mechanism to get that thinking into national systems.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Miriam, and thanks, Mark. A very thought-provoking presentation. I just want to know something, like your new proposed modeling paradigm that you are proposing. How does that would help in global negotiation in terms of when you offer the new modeling paradigm that you are proposing?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and it plays to the fact that, you know, can you just introduce a brand new approach? So the straight answer is I don't think that's knowable until we give it a try. I would argue that continuing with the present orthodoxy is inherently wrong-headed, and I'll give an example of this. So the integrated assessment modeling community, which is essentially the example that I give for optimization and a consultative modeling approach. The integrated assessment modeling community had been placing negative emissions technologies within their models to inform the IPCC process as early as 1998, 1999. And people only found out how much negative emissions were being placed in these models. And when I say how much, I'm talking billions of tons of negative emissions. I mean, they're talking about in some of the scenarios, populating with trees the equivalent of about 2 or 3 land masses the size of India. And yet, as a part of the negotiations and a part of the ways that the integrated assessment modeling community was feeding this information into the IPCC negotiation process, because you get a discrete line on the standard integrated assessment modeling outputs, you have no idea what is in that line. And therefore, all the decision maker wants as a function of just heuristics and psychological cognitive engagement is, oh, you can do it. You don't go on to ask the question, what is in there to make that happen? And the modeling community will say, well, it's not my job to tell the decision makers what to do. Now, that can't be right. And ultimately, it was only until 2016, 2017 that the integrated assessment modeling community said, you know what? We've been placing so much negative emissions in there. And by the way, there is no such thing as a negative emissions sector. It's something that the models just made up for us, that we need to start thinking about this. And so you can't have, to have a decision support tool that hides from the negotiators and the decision-making process for up to 15 to 20 years, a technology that needed all that time to scale, if you genuinely were integrating it into your decision support tool, cannot be right. So that's a way of saying that the present orthodoxy can't be right. I haven't answered your question, Mansoor, as to whether or not exploratory modeling approaches will make things better. I just think that it's got to be better than the present way that things are done. And it would require experimentation and capacity building in order to do that. But we've got to do away with the overdependence on these very simple modeling processes that are steeped as being scientific and fact when they are actually just projections and what if scenarios.
Thank you.
We have a question in the Q&A. Abraham says, thanks for the insightful talk. You highlighted the issue of scalar uncertainty and net zero transmission. Considering the everyday economy in the global south, what is the outlook of net zero in this area, and what governance approach would work best for these economies?
Oh, so that's a great question, and I'm obviously very much white, and my education is very much from the Anglo-Saxon sphere, though my mother is a crazy Chinese woman. The honest answer is I don't know, because I think we need to talk to people about this. It's not my, with the global, I don't like this global north-south stuff, but I will articulate it because it falls into a rhetorical convenience that helps me answer the question. Ultimately, at the moment, the North has created 80% of the emissions that are resulting in these sort of unpredictable and unprecedented weather conditions. So there has to be a bigger burden share based on the fact that the global North and the richer countries have burnt the fossil fuels, effectively generated negative externalities, and at the moment, because of the power, and ultimately allow their economies to grow to the point that they are arguably more resilient than perhaps other non-OECD countries or global South countries. So I'm not sure it is the role of the OECD or global North to tell the South what they should or shouldn't do. It is more what the North needs to do to lead by example, having created the problem in the first place. How that cascades over and results in spillover effects to those in the global South who have an absolute right to develop economically is not really my place to say. And ultimately, that's something that these global South countries need to think about for themselves. And it's up to the North to lead by example and allow the benefits of that leading by example to spill over to make things easier and cheaper for those in the global South. Now, that was a very quixotic answer to your question and sidesteps any political landmines that might have trodden on. The political economy of it all, of course, is very different. I'll just leave ... on that.
Well, I think we're out of time, but thank you so much, Mark. This was a fantastic presentation. I'll be sure to share any additional questions with you. I'm also so glad that you brought up some concrete examples of future collaboration. So I encourage colleagues to reach out to Dr. Mark Workman. And again, thank you very, very much for sharing your insights with us. Thank you all for tuning in this week. Remind you that our recordings are available on our website, and we look forward to seeing you all next week.
That's great.
Thank you
Absolute
very
pleasure.
much.
Thanks for the opportunity, all. Take care. All right. Bye.